The first time Henry heard the broadcast, he thought it was just a trick of insomnia. His sleepless nights had stretched into weeks, his mind restless, his body unwilling to surrender to rest. He was slouched on the old recliner in his living room, the glow of a forgotten lamp casting a weak, amber light across the stacks of books and papers on his coffee table. Out of boredom, or maybe desperation, he twisted the dial of his battered old radio, a habit he'd developed when the silence of the night felt unbearable. Static crackled and hissed, fragments of half-faded stations fading in and out like voices bleeding through thin walls. Then, without warning, the static sharpened, and a low, steady voice cut through the hum. Calm. Gentle. Too intimate. It wasn't the usual booming radio announcer, nor the cheerful late-night host who filled dead air with mindless chatter. This voice was different. It sounded as if the speaker were sitting right beside him, leaning close, whispering straight into his ear. "Good evening, night wanderer. I know you're awake." Henry froze, the tiny hairs on the back of his neck prickling upright. He blinked at the radio, his hand hovering over the dial, uncertain if he'd misheard. But the voice continued, its tone smooth, unhurried, and disturbingly familiar. "You've been pacing, haven't you? 3 nights in a row. You've been telling yourself tomorrow you'll rest, but tomorrow never comes." At first, Henry thought it had to be some kind of coincidence, a vague line meant for anyone, the kind of generic observation that could fit thousands of insomniacs tuning in at this hour. But then, the voice shifted, its calmness slipping into something sharper, more personal, as though the speaker were watching him through the walls of his home. "You keep your lamp on at night because you're afraid of what waits in the dark corners of the room. You're not wrong to be afraid." Henry's stomach dropped. His mouth went dry. He looked around the small, dimly lit room, his eyes darting toward the corners where the shadows pooled, thick and unbroken. The radio speaker chuckled softly, a sound that was almost comforting, almost human, but there was a thin, rasping undertone beneath it, like static catching on teeth. Henry's rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a prank, some elaborate broadcast made to feel eerie, designed for late-night thrill seekers. Perhaps other listeners were hearing similar words, twisted to sound personal, tailored to match their fears. That had to be it. But then the voice said his name. Henry. Just that. Nothing more. Nothing less. The sound of it was enough to hollow the air out of the room. His heart stuttered painfully in his chest, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't move. He had never once called into a station, never signed up for any late-night programs, never even spoken his name aloud in his apartment tonight. And yet, here it was, spoken with such casual certainty, as though the man behind the microphone had known him his whole life. The broadcast continued, the words sinking deeper, more invasive with each passing second. "You're wondering how I know you. You're wondering if you're alone. You're not. You never are." Henry slammed his hand against the dial, spinning it until the voice dissolved back into static. But no matter how far he turned the knob, no matter which station he skipped through, the voice always came back. Stronger. Closer. Until it felt less like a broadcast on the radio, and more like a whisper threading directly into his skull. The air around him seemed heavier now, pressing against his chest, weighing down his thoughts. He tried shutting the radio off entirely, yanking the cord from the wall. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't silence at all. Because when the radio died, the whispering didn't. It lingered. It lingered inside the room. Henry didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The whispers clung to him long after he ripped the plug from the wall, the silence of the room thick and deceptive, as if hiding something just beyond the range of his hearing. Every creak of the old apartment building sounded like a voice in disguise. Every shadow seemed to shiver when he looked away. By dawn, his body felt leaden with exhaustion, but his mind was sharper than ever, buzzing with questions he couldn't shake. He shoved the radio into the hall closet, burying it beneath blankets as though distance alone could muffle its unnatural reach. Yet even at work, as he shuffled papers at his desk and tried to smile at coworkers who asked if he was all right, he swore he heard faint static under the hum of the office lights. When someone said his name at the water cooler, he nearly dropped his cup, because for a split second the voice wasn't his coworker's, it was the one from last night. By the time evening fell again, he told himself it had been a hallucination brought on by insomnia. Sleep deprivation could do strange things: whispers in empty rooms, figures in the corner of your eye. Rational explanations kept his fear at bay, until the urge to test the truth returned like an itch under his skin. He told himself he'd prove it wasn't real. That's all. Just switch on the radio, surf the channels, and confirm there was nothing there. Then he'd finally rest. But the moment his fingers brushed the dial, static filled the room, and before he could even adjust the knob, the voice was there again, calm, steady, patient. "Welcome back, Henry." His blood froze. The voice didn't skip a beat, didn't hesitate as if it had been waiting all day for his return. "You tried to hide me. You tried to forget. But you can't shut me out. You know that now." Henry felt sweat bead on his forehead as he gripped the radio tighter, his knuckles pale against the old plastic. "Who are you?" he whispered hoarsely, his throat raw from sleeplessness. The laugh that followed was soft, almost tender, but beneath it was something jagged, like a blade being drawn across glass. "A friend. A guide. A voice you've always needed, whether you admit it or not." Henry's stomach nodded as the broadcast continued. "And you're not the only one listening, Henry. Not by far. Look outside." Against his better judgment, Henry crossed to the window and peered down into the street below. For a moment, all looked normal: empty sidewalks, the glow of a street lamp flickering against cracked pavement. But then he noticed them. Two figures across the street, standing in perfect stillness, their faces obscured by shadow. Both had radios clutched in their hands. Both turned their heads toward him at the exact same second. Henry's breath hitched. He staggered back, his pulse roaring in his ears. The voice chuckled again, low and knowing. "We're all awake, Henry. You. Them. Others scattered across the country, tuning in when the rest of the world sleeps. We are the audience. And now, you are part of the show." Henry wanted to smash the radio, hurl it out the window, anything to sever the connection. But a terrible curiosity rooted him in place. The idea that he wasn't alone, that others were trapped in this midnight ritual, was both horrifying and oddly comforting. He wasn't losing his mind. Something was happening. Something larger than him. He pressed closer to the radio, heart pounding, as the voice continued, "Tonight, we'll play a little game. You know games, don't you? Rules. Consequences. Survival. I'll ask a question. You answer truthfully, or you'll see what happens when you lie to me." Henry swallowed hard, his throat dry. The air in the room seemed heavier, as though the very walls leaned closer, listening. What kind of question?" His voice cracked. The reply came with eerie cheer, like a host warming up an audience. "Tell me, Henry, what's the one thing you've done that no one must ever know? The one secret you've buried so deep you've convinced yourself it never happened. Say it now. Or I'll say it for you." Henry's entire body went cold. His lips parted, but no words came. He didn't know if the voice was bluffing, if this was some elaborate psychological trick, or if it really could reach into the locked vault of his past. But before he could respond, the static flared violently, and the voice's tone dropped to a guttural whisper that scraped at his bones. "Time's up, Henry." Henry's heart hammered in his chest, each thud echoing in his ears as though the very sound might give him away. He wanted to speak, to confess something, anything, just to end the unbearable weight of silence pressing down on him. But his throat was tight, strangled by fear, and his mind scrambled through memories he had spent years burying. Then, as though peeling back the skin of his thoughts, the voice slid in, sharp and unrelenting. "It was in the summer of '98, wasn't it? That night by the reservoir. The one you promised yourself you'd forget." Henry's knees buckled, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. His vision swam, the room tilting as nausea rose in his gut. No one knew about that night. No one. Not even the friends who had been there with him could speak of it without choking on the silence they had all agreed to keep. He stumbled toward the radio, clawing at the dial, but the plastic knob spun uselessly beneath his fingers. The station locked like a door bolted from the inside. The voice went on, its cadence unhurried, confident, each syllable a needle sinking into old wounds. You thought it was an accident. You told yourself the darkness covered your mistakes. But the water remembers, Henry. It always remembers. His breath came in shallow gasps as sweat beaded along his forehead. He couldn't look at the radio anymore. It felt alive, pulsing, like a heart beating on his table. But when he turned away, he caught sight of the window again. The figures across the street had multiplied. What had been 2 shadowed listeners before were now 5, their outlines still, rigid, their radios glowing faintly in the dark like fireflies pinned against glass. A sick realization crawled through him. They had heard it too. His secret. The broadcast wasn't contained within his apartment. It wasn't private. The voice was exposing him, stripping him bare in front of strangers who seemed less like passers-by and more like disciples waiting for his damnation. Panic surged, and Henry snapped. He lunged for the radio, yanking it off the table, cords snapping like tendons. With a guttural yell, he hurled it across the room, the device shattering against the far wall in an explosion of sparks and plastic shards. For a moment, silence reclaimed the apartment, raw and ringing. Henry collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, hands trembling violently. Then, static. It oozed from the broken halves of the radio as though the machine refused to die. The fragments crackled, the voice slithering back through the busted speaker with mocking clarity. Oh, Henry. That temper of yours. Do you think breaking me changes anything? I'm not in the radio. I'm in you. I've always been in you. His stomach lurched as bile rose in his throat. He staggered to his feet and stumbled back from the pieces, pressing himself against the wall as if distance might shield him from the sound. But then another noise threaded in, soft and distinct, overlapping the voice, like dozens of whispers carried on a single frequency. Words he couldn't decipher at first, until they grew louder, sharper, unified. We hear you. We see you. We know you. Henry's body stiffened, every muscle locked. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't alone. The unseen audience was chanting in unison, the sounds spilling into his apartment as though a crowd had gathered outside his door. His pulse spiked, sweat stung his eyes, and before he realized what he was doing, he was rushing to the window again. The street below was no longer empty. It was packed. Dozens of figures now, each holding a radio, each standing in unnatural stillness. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Yet he could hear their voices in perfect harmony, funneling through the air, vibrating in his bones. His mind screamed at him to run. To get out, flee, escape while he still could. He grabbed his coat, his keys, anything his hands could clutch, and bolted for the door. The moment he stepped into the hall, however, his blood turned to ice. Radios. Radios on the floor, on the stairs, on the railings, each one tuned to the same frequency, each one hissing and whispering as he passed. The entire building seemed infested with them, the walls alive with static and secrets. He tore down the staircase 2 steps at a time, ignoring the ache in his legs, his only thought to reach the front door. But as he shoved it open and staggered into the night, the chanting voices stopped abruptly. The silence that replaced them was worse, thick, oppressive, expectant. Then the voice returned. Not from a single radio. Not from any machine. It came from everywhere at once, the streetlights, the pavement, the very air vibrating with it. Run if you want, Henry. But remember, the broadcast always follows its audience. You can't tune out forever. Henry's head snapped up, his chest tight, as he saw movement in the crowd at last. Dozens of shadowed faces turned upward toward him in unison. And then, smiles. Dozens of identical, stretching smiles, like masks painted onto shadows. Henry ran. His lungs burned, each breath tearing at his chest as he shoved through the crowd that seemed to part for him and yet close and just enough to brush against his sleeves, cold fingertips grazing his skin as though marking him. Their faces were indistinct in the streetlight glow, but every single one wore that same grin, thin, knowing, endless. The whispering static followed him like a shadow, rising in pitch the faster he sprinted. He cut down alleyways, his footsteps slapping against wet pavement, his pulse thundering in his ears. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to put distance between himself and those frozen, smiling figures. But every turn he made, every block he crossed, he caught glimpses of them again, standing at corners, clustered under flickering lamps, holding their radios close to their chests as though cradling something sacred. And each time, when his eyes landed on them, their heads tilted in unison, as if acknowledging his passage, their whispers rippling into the night. By the time Henry stumbled onto the main road, his legs felt heavy, his throat raw from sucking in the frigid air. He spotted the neon glow of an all-night diner ahead, its sign buzzing and crackling in protest against the wind. The sight of something so normal, so mundane, filled him with a desperate kind of hope. He staggered through the door, the bell above jangling wildly. The warmth inside enveloped him, and for the first time since the broadcast began, he felt a sliver of relief. A waitress with tired eyes glanced up from behind the counter, her pen poised over an order pad. "You look like hell," she muttered, her voice dry but not unkind. Henry tried to laugh, but it came out as a wheeze. He slid into a booth near the back, his hands trembling as he pulled the menu closer, more for something to do than because he was hungry. He kept glancing at the door, half expecting the crowd to follow him inside. But instead, a different sound filled the diner, the faint, tinny buzz of a small radio perched behind the counter. Henry's stomach dropped as the familiar static poured through the speaker, followed by the voice he had prayed he'd escaped. "There you are, Henry. Running won't save you. You should know that by now." His fork clattered to the floor, and the waitress raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" she asked, but her tone was detached, as though she already knew the answer. The broadcast went on, and this time Henry realized with dawning horror that the waitress wasn't reacting to the voice at all. She heard nothing. Or worse, she chose not to acknowledge it. Henry's hands curled into fists. "Turn it off," he rasped, pointing toward the radio. The waitress blinked, confused. "What radio?" she asked. The words hit him like a blade. He stared at the counter, at the device sitting in plain sight, its antenna bent, its dial glowing faintly red. She truly didn't see it. His stomach twisted as he realized the truth: the broadcast wasn't for everyone. It chose its audience. And once chosen, you couldn't unhear it. The voice chuckled again, the sound reverberating through the diner like a secret shared between old friends. "You're not alone tonight, Henry. There are others. Listeners like you. And some of them are closer than you think." Before Henry could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled again. A man and a woman stepped inside, their movements oddly synchronized. They were dressed plainly, jeans, jackets, nothing remarkable, but Henry's blood ran cold as he spotted the radios clutched in their hands. They scanned the diner with sharp, deliberate eyes, and then their gazes locked onto him. Slowly, unnervingly, they smiled. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He pushed back from the booth, but before he could stand, the man raised a finger to his lips, a chilling gesture of silence. The woman placed her radio on the nearest table, and the static hissed louder, filling the diner with a suffocating hum. The voice returned, smooth and pleased. "Ah, yes. My loyal audience. Look at you, Henry. You've already met your first fans." Henry's body tensed. He realized now with terrible clarity, he wasn't just listening to the broadcast anymore. He had become a part of it. Henry sat frozen in the booth, his body stiff as though he were a marionette waiting for strings to yank him upward. The man and woman stood at the entrance of the diner, silent, their smiles too still, too deliberate, as though they'd been stitched onto their faces. Their radios hissed softly, both devices tuned to the same impossible station, their faint red dials glowing in eerie unison. Nobody else in the diner reacted. The waitress refilled a coffee cup at another booth, humming to herself as though nothing were amiss. A trucker in a stained cap slurped his soup, oblivious. It was as if Henry had slipped into another layer of reality, one where only he could perceive the intruders. The broadcast whispered louder in his ears than ever before, its voice threaded with static, intimate and mocking. "Don't be rude, Henry. Say hello to your audience." The woman moved first. She walked toward him with deliberate slowness, her boots striking the tiled floor in a steady rhythm, each step syncing with Henry's pounding pulse. She slid into the booth across from him, folding her hands neatly in front of her. Her nails were painted black, chipped at the edges, as though she had been scratching at something hard for days. The man followed, but instead of sitting, he stood by the end of the table, his eyes locked on Henry's face with unblinking intensity. Neither spoke. They simply stared, waiting, their expressions taut with expectation. Henry's throat was dry. He forced words out, his voice cracking. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head, a jerky, unnatural motion. "We listen," she whispered, her voice oddly flat, as though she were reciting lines she had memorized long ago. The man added, "We follow." His voice was deeper, but carried the same mechanical detachment. Their words overlapped, synchronized, the way voices sometimes did when radios picked up overlapping frequencies. Henry shook his head, sweat dripping down the back of his neck. "Why me? Why are you following me?" The broadcast answered before they could. "Because you're special, Henry. Because you're awake when the world sleeps. Because you hear me." The laughter that followed was soft but endless, as though looping on itself. The woman smiled wider, leaning in until Henry could see the faint tremor at the corner of her mouth. "You don't understand yet," she said, almost lovingly. "But you will." Henry shoved back from the booth, his chair screeching against the floor. Nobody in the diner reacted, not the waitress, not the trucker, not the two teens slouched at the counter sipping milkshakes. It was like none of them could even see what was happening. Henry's stomach turned, bile rising in his throat. He bolted for the door, his heart hammering against his ribs, desperate for air. But as his hand gripped the handle, the man's voice rang out, not loud, but perfectly clear, slicing through the hum of the diner and straight into Henry's skull. "Run if you want. We'll always be waiting." Henry froze, the words pinning him in place. He didn't look back. He pushed the door open and stumbled into the night, the cold air slapping him in the face. But the moment he stepped outside, his blood ran cold. Across the street, beneath the pale glow of a failing street lamp, more of them waited. 5, 6, maybe 7 figures. Each clutched a radio to their chest, each glowing faintly red. Their faces were half hidden in shadow, but Henry knew, he felt, their eyes on him. Watching. Waiting. Smiling. The broadcast swelled again, louder than ever, its voice filling the streets. "You can't escape an audience, Henry. They'll follow you anywhere. After all, the show must go on." Henry staggered backward, his hands trembling so violently he thought his bones might rattle apart. He wanted to scream, but his voice was gone. The crowd across the street didn't move, didn't blink. They simply stood there, patient as statues, their radios crackling in unison with the same static he heard in his head. Henry realized something then, something that made his stomach twist into ice. These weren't random strangers. He recognized some of them. The old man who lived 2 blocks from his apartment. The cashier from the corner store. A woman he'd seen jogging in the park. People from his own life, people who had been around him for years, now stood united, revealed as part of this hidden, listening audience. And the worst part? Their radios weren't new. Some looked battered, decades old. Some were models Henry hadn't seen since childhood. This wasn't something new. It had been going on for a long, long time. Henry's knees nearly buckled. The broadcast chuckled again, warm and coaxing, like a friend who had always been by his side. "You see it now, don't you? You've always been part of the program. And soon, Henry, you'll take your place behind the mic. Henry stumbled backward into the dark, the street spinning around him, the weight of inevitability pressing down on his chest. He understood now. The broadcast wasn't just predicting his fate, it was writing it. Henry staggered home through the empty streets, his breath ragged, every shadow seeming to stretch longer than it should. He didn't dare look behind him, though he could feel their presence, those silent figures with their radios, following at a distance, never rushing, never needing to. They didn't have to chase him, they had already caught him. By the time he slammed his apartment door shut and twisted the lock with shaking hands, he was drenched in cold sweat, his chest heaving like he had run for miles. He pressed his back against the door, listening. Silence. The kind of silence that rang in your ears and carried weight, a silence that almost dared him to breathe too loud. Then, faintly, the static started again. Not from his head, not from his memories of the diner, it was inside his apartment. A low hiss, crawling along the floorboards, slipping through the walls like smoke. Henry's eyes darted around wildly until they fell on his old radio, the one that had first picked up the broadcast. It sat on the shelf where he'd left it, its power knob turned firmly to off, the cord dangling loose from the wall. Yet the red dial glowed faintly, pulsing as though in rhythm with a heartbeat. Henry lunged for it, ripping the radio from the shelf and hurling it to the ground. Plastic cracked, knobs snapped off, and the device split open with a metallic shriek. For a moment, silence returned, blessed and clean. But then another sound filled the room, dozens of faint whispers rising together, overlapping like a broken choir. Henry spun in place, horror flooding him as he realized the sound wasn't coming from the broken radio. It was coming from the others. Radios he didn't remember owning. On his desk, an ancient transistor radio buzzed faintly. In the kitchen, a battered boombox hummed. In his bedroom, the glow of another dial flickered beneath the crack of the door. Radios, different models, from different decades, sat in corners of the apartment he swore had been empty. They weren't plugged in, but every one of them breathed with the same pulse of static, like living things pretending to be machines. Henry grabbed the nearest one, a heavy box from the 70s, and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, sparks hissing from the exposed wires. But instead of stopping, the static only grew louder, more insistent. Another voice rose within it, one he hadn't heard before, low, guttural, commanding. You can't silence us, Henry. The broadcast doesn't come from the radios. It comes from you. His blood froze. He stumbled back, staring at the broken pieces on the floor, then at the dozens of other radios glowing in the dimness of his apartment. The voice was right, the sound wasn't radiating from the machines. It was radiating through him. His skull throbbed with pressure, like an invisible frequency was being broadcast straight into his brain. Henry clutched his head, teeth grinding as the voices swelled inside him. They layered and overlapped, some familiar, some strange, all whispering his name with unbearable intimacy. Henry. 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 Some laughed. Some begged. Some cried. But one voice cut through them all, smooth and confident, the host he'd been hearing night after night. Don't fight it, Henry. You were never just a listener. You were chosen. You've been tuned in your whole life, whether you knew it or not. The only question is, when will you accept your role? Henry screamed and lunged for the drawer in his kitchen, pulling out a hammer with trembling hands. He didn't think. He just swung, smashing the nearest radio into splinters, then another, then another. Each crash only seemed to intensify the static, the broken pieces writhing faintly as though trying to reassemble themselves. The glowing dials burned brighter, bathing the apartment in a sickly red light. His ears rang, his head pounded, and still the broadcast continued unfazed. Finally, Henry collapsed to his knees, hammer clattering to the floor. He clamped his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth like a child. Stop, stop, please stop, he muttered, but his own voice was drowned out. The broadcast had grown deafening, so loud he thought it would split his skull in two. And then, suddenly, silence. Not the soft hush of a dead frequency, but a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on him like deep ocean water. The red glow faded. The radios stopped. For a single, trembling second, Henry thought it was over. But then the lights in his apartment flickered, and from the cracked face of the broken radio on the floor, the voice returned, closer than ever, intimate, almost affectionate. "Now you understand, Henry. The radios were never the source. They were only the invitations. The signal is inside you. And once you begin to broadcast..." The dial, cracked and split, still managed to glow faintly red. The voice chuckled. "The world will listen." Henry stumbled backward into the corner, his chest heaving, his hammer forgotten. He understood now. Smashing radios wouldn't save him. Running wouldn't save him. The signal had already claimed him. He wasn't fighting to survive anymore, he was fighting not to become. Henry barely slept that night. If he drifted off for even a second, the static seeped into his dreams, pulling him back to the red glow of the dial, to the voice that whispered directly into the folds of his brain. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard his name stretched out long, distorted, as if dragged across an old cassette tape. Henry I. By dawn, he wasn't sure whether he was awake or trapped inside another frequency. When he finally rose from the floor, his body felt heavy, drained, like the weight of the signal had burrowed deep into his muscles. The apartment was silent again, unnervingly so. The shattered remains of the radios still littered the floor, wires splayed like veins. He staggered to the bathroom and stared at himself in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and drawn, but what chilled him most wasn't exhaustion, it was the faint buzzing he heard inside his own head, like the hum of a station between channels. Henry pressed his palms against his temples, shaking his head violently as if he could shake the sound loose. But then a new noise reached him, 3 soft knocks against his door. He froze. Whoever it was, they didn't knock again. The silence stretched until Henry thought he'd imagined it. Then, slowly, mechanically, his legs carried him to the door. He opened it. 3 people stood in the hallway. Not strangers, faces he remembered from the diner. The listeners. The young woman with the blank eyes, the old man with the trembling hands, the man in the work uniform. They stood in a neat row, their postures too rigid, their heads tilted slightly, like dolls waiting to be wound. Each held a small portable radio, its antenna extended, its red dial glowing faintly in the morning light. Henry's throat tightened. He tried to slam the door shut, but the old man caught it with surprising strength. The door didn't budge. The young woman stepped forward, her voice flat but oddly melodic. "You shouldn't resist. It hurts more when you resist." Henry's stomach lurched. "What do you want from me?" he hissed. The man in the uniform raised his radio, the faint hiss of static spilling into the hallway. "It's not about what we want, Henry. It's about what you are." The old man leaned closer, his eyes sunken but sharp. "We've been listening a long time. Waiting for the host to choose. And now, he's chosen you." Henry's mouth went dry. "Host." The young woman smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "Every broadcast needs a voice. Every voice needs a vessel. The last one spoke for nearly 50 years. Then the signal began to wane. You've heard him. You've felt him. He's passing it on." Henry shook his head violently, backing away. "No. I'm not doing this. I'm not part of this." But the old man's voice rose above him, booming with conviction that made Henry's skin crawl. "You don't have a choice. The signal is inside you now. Do you really think the static would leave once it's entered? You don't tune out the broadcast, Henry. The broadcast tunes you." Henry staggered backward into the apartment, but the 3 listeners followed him in, closing the door softly behind them. The radios they carried grew louder, filling the space with an overlapping hum that seemed to sync with the pounding of his heart. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the couch, trembling as their words swirled around him. The man in uniform leaned down, his face inches from Henry's. "You've noticed it already. The silence is gone. You hum with the signal. You feel it under your skin. Soon, when the hour strikes midnight, the first words will leave your mouth. You won't even realize you're speaking them. And once you begin, you won't be able to stop. Henry shook his head, tears burning his eyes. No, I won't. I won't do it. The young woman crouched in front of him, tilting her head. Do you think the last host wanted it? Do you think he volunteered? No, Henry. But the moment he tried to resist, the signal twisted him. It hollowed him out until all that was left was the voice. That's not death, Henry. That's something worse. That's erasure. The static swelled around them until Henry felt it vibrating in his bones. His hands gripped the edge of the couch, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to scream, to run. But deep inside, beneath the panic, beneath the horror, he felt a flicker of something else. A warmth. A strange, almost soothing resonance. And the terrifying part was, it felt good. It was as though the signal had been there all along, waiting, and now that it had fully awakened, part of him longed to surrender to it. The old man straightened, raising his radio higher. Tonight, Henry. At midnight. The broadcast begins again. The voice will fade, and yours will rise. And when you speak. The static roared, rattling the windows, filling the room with an otherworldly vibration that made Henry's teeth ache. The world will hear you. Henry didn't wait for them to leave. As soon as the three listeners closed the apartment door behind them, he sprang into motion. He didn't care where he went or how far, he just knew he had to get away. He stuffed a change of clothes into a backpack, shoved his wallet and car keys into his pocket, and bolted for the stairwell without looking back. The building was suffocating with silence, but his own pulse thundered in his ears like a war drum. Every flickering light bulb, every creak of the steps felt like a warning, it's too late. He burst into the open air, sucking in a deep breath like he'd been drowning. The streets were quiet, but not peaceful. They had that eerie, abandoned quality he'd noticed more and more lately, as if the world had emptied out to make room for something else. He sprinted across the lot to his car, fumbling the keys with shaking hands. The static buzzed faintly in his head, a low hum that rose and fell like waves. He clenched his jaw, shoved the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Just drive, he muttered to himself. Just drive. He tore out of the lot, the tires screeching as he turned onto the road. Street lamps streaked past in stuttering flashes of yellow, the town blurring behind him. He pressed harder on the accelerator, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The static in his head seemed to protest, rising in pitch as though trying to tether him back. He shook his head violently, gripping the wheel tighter. No. Not tonight. Not ever. For a while, it worked. The road opened up into the dark countryside, the town shrinking in his rearview mirror. Henry dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could outrun this thing. But 20 miles out, the first sign appeared. It was a small diner, neon lights buzzing faintly against the darkness. He barely glanced at it until something inside caught his eye. Through the front windows, he saw them, 3 figures sitting silently in a booth. Not eating, not speaking, just sitting, their portable radios glowing red against the glass. Henry's stomach dropped. He pressed harder on the gas, flying past the diner at 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. His heart hammered as the headlights carved through the night. But then, a few miles down the road, he saw another diner. Identical. Same neon sign, same shape. And through its windows, the same 3 figures sat, waiting. No, his voice cracked, raw with panic. He sped past it, then another, then another. The same building repeated over and over, like he was driving through a looped film reel. Each time, the radios glowed brighter, their static louder, even though the windows of his car were rolled up tight. His head pounded, the hum vibrating through his bones. Finally, Henry slammed his foot on the brake, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. He sat there in the middle of the empty road, chest heaving, sweat soaking his shirt. His hands trembled on the wheel as he forced himself to look in the rearview mirror. Behind him, stretching into the distance, were countless diners. Row after row after row, identical, all glowing faintly in the night. And in every window, the three listeners sat waiting. Henry screamed, pounding the steering wheel with both fists. "Let me go!" His voice cracked, desperate, but the only answer was the rising static inside his head. It filled the car, shaking the glass, rattling the dashboard. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound only grew louder, more consuming. Then, through the roar, the host's voice emerged again, calm and steady as always. "There is nowhere to run, Henry. The broadcast has no borders. No highways. No maps. You can drive until the stars burn out, and still, you'll be tuned in." The static pulsed, vibrating the car until Henry thought it might shake apart. His headlights flickered, dimmed, then went out completely, plunging him into suffocating black. The engine died, and the car sat lifeless in the middle of the endless road. The only light came from the faint, red glow of the dashboard radio, though Henry swore he had never turned it on. The dial moved by itself, sliding smoothly until it stopped at a frequency Henry had come to dread. The static quieted, and the host's voice poured out, richer and clearer than ever before. "It's almost midnight, Henry. You can't run from the signal. You are the signal." Henry slammed his fists against the unresponsive dashboard, his own voice breaking in raw despair. "Why me? Why me?" The radio's dial pulsed red, steady as a heartbeat. The host chuckled softly, almost kindly. "Every broadcast chooses its voice. And some voices are born to carry." The static roared again, swallowing Henry's cries, filling every corner of the night. The night air was so thick with static it seemed to cling to Henry's skin, crawling like invisible insects. He stumbled from the dead car, his breath pluming white in the cold air. All around him, the rows of identical diners stretched on forever, each one glowing faintly with their crimson lights, each one containing the same three listeners, watching, waiting, patient as statues. He tried not to look at them, but every time his eyes wandered, he caught the glimmer of their radios pulsing like embers. Henry staggered forward down the empty road, the world hushed except for the thrum inside his skull. He didn't know why his legs moved, maybe because standing still felt worse, like the earth itself would open beneath him. His feet scraped against the asphalt, his body trembling with exhaustion. And then, through the silence, he heard it, a voice carried on the air, low and ragged, not from a radio but from somewhere ahead. "Henry." He froze. That voice, he recognized it instantly. It was the host. The same cadence, the same rhythm. But now it sounded weaker, strained, as though spoken by a dying man. Henry's chest tightened. Against all logic, he followed the sound. Each step seemed to draw him closer to something not entirely of this world. The diners faded, their glow dimming until he stood at the edge of a cliff that hadn't been there moments before. Below, the black ocean churned and foamed, waves slamming against jagged rocks. And at the very end of the cliff, a single lighthouse rose into the night. Its walls were cracked and crumbling, the paint stripped away by decades of storms. The great lantern at the top flickered with a dull, sickly red light that turned the ocean into a sheet of blood. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He knew this place, not from memory, but from the broadcast. The host had described it once, in a casual aside, as if telling a story. "We guide them, don't we? From the edge of the world, where the sea swallows all." Henry stumbled toward it, drawn by something stronger than fear. The heavy door at the base groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the spiral staircase coiled upward into endless darkness, each step echoing like a heartbeat. And at the top, in the lantern room, the voice called again, clearer now, though still faint. "Henry, come closer." When Henry reached the top, he nearly collapsed. The lantern room was small, suffocating with the smell of salt and rust. The great lamp flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. And seated beside it, slumped in a worn wooden chair, was the host. He was a man, or at least he had been once. His face was pale, stretched thin, the skin clinging to bone as though eaten away from within. His lips were cracked, his eyes sunken deep, but when they lifted to Henry, they burned with a strange, feverish light. His voice, though hoarse, carried that same magnetic pull Henry had come to dread. "So, you finally found me." Henry's mouth went dry. His body trembled, not from fear alone, but from the realization that this frail, dying figure was the one who had controlled the airwaves, who had whispered to thousands in the dark. You're real," Henry managed to choke out. The host gave a hollow smile, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Real enough. Though not for much longer." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Henry flinch. "The signal eats through you, Henry. It takes everything, your strength, your thoughts, even your name. It hollows you out until nothing remains but the voice." Henry shook his head, backing toward the door. "No. I won't let it happen. I'm not like you." The host's laughter rasped like sandpaper. "Not like me? Henry, I was just like you once. A man who stumbled too close to the frequency. A man who thought he could resist. But resistance only makes the signal stronger." His voice softened, almost tender. "Why do you think it chose you, Henry? You already carry it. You hum with it. I can hear it in your breath." Henry clutched his chest, as if trying to smother the thrum beneath his ribs. "There has to be a way out. There has to be a way to stop it." The host's eyes flickered with something that might have been pity. He reached a trembling hand toward the glowing lantern, its light sputtering like a dying heart. "This is the end of the road. There's no way out, only through. The only mercy the signal gives is that you don't remember what came before." Henry's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" The host's voice dropped to a whisper, raw and broken. "You've done this before, Henry. We all have. When the broadcast fades, the voice must pass on. You think this is the first time you've stood here? You think this is the first time you've said I won't do it? No, you've stood here countless times. You've worn this body, this name, 1,000 times." Henry's vision swam. His knees buckled as the words sank in. "No, that's not possible." The host's hand clenched weakly against the lantern. His eyes locked on Henry's, fierce despite the frailty of his body. "When midnight comes, you'll speak. And when you speak, you'll forget. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. That's why you don't remember, because the broadcast erases you." The red light surged, filling the room, filling Henry's head until he thought it would split open. The host's voice rose one final time, ragged and desperate. "You can run. You can smash the radios. You can scream until your throat tears. But when the clock strikes 12, Henry, you will speak." And with those words, the host slumped back, the last breath rattling out of him. The lantern flared brilliantly for a moment, then dimmed, its glow sinking until it pulsed faintly in rhythm with Henry's own heart. He stood there, paralyzed, the truth pressing down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. He wasn't just the chosen successor. He was the eternal successor. This had happened before. It would happen again. And there was no escaping the cycle. The red lantern's pulse throbbed in time with Henry's racing heart, each flicker echoing like a drumbeat inside his skull. The host's body slumped lifeless in the chair, but the room was not silent. The air vibrated, a low hum reverberating through the walls, through the glass, through Henry's very bones. It was the same hum that had haunted him since the first night he heard the broadcast, only now, it wasn't on the radio. It was inside him. Henry staggered backward, clutching his head as the sound grew louder. He could feel words forming at the edges of his consciousness, phrases he hadn't yet spoken but that were already etched into him, waiting to spill out. He pressed his hands over his mouth as if that could stop it. "No, I won't. I won't say it. I won't let you take me." But the signal didn't care for his protests. It swelled like a tide, pushing through him, filling the hollow spaces of his body where fear and hope had once lived. The lighthouse groaned under the weight of it, the glass panes trembling, the floor vibrating as though the entire structure was alive and breathing with him. Henry's knees gave out, and he collapsed to the floorboards, gasping. That's when he heard the clock. A faint, deliberate ticking. Slow. Inevitable. Each second rang out, resonating through the room with the clarity of a hammer striking metal. Henry's eyes darted upward. There was no clock in the lantern room, yet the sound came from everywhere, the walls, the lantern, the air itself. Midnight was coming. He crawled to the chair where the host's body sat, shaking it violently. Tell me how to stop it. Tell me how to make it end. But the dead man's face remained slack, pale lips slightly parted, as if mocking Henry with the silence. Henry's breathing grew ragged. The world spun around him, the shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human, faces of listeners, their eyes hollow, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly, waiting for the words that he would speak. The walls seemed to close in, squeezing him tighter, forcing him toward the lantern at the center of the room. No, he whispered, shaking his head violently. Not me. Not again. I won't be your voice. The hum rose to a piercing frequency, making his teeth ache and his skull throb. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it was no use, the sound wasn't outside him. It was within, resonating in his chest, in his lungs, in his throat. His mouth opened against his will, lips trembling as syllables fought to escape. The clock ticked louder, faster now. 11:59. Henry scrambled to his feet, staggering toward the lantern. His reflection stared back at him in the glass panes, warped by the red glow. For a fleeting second, he didn't recognize himself. His eyes glowed faintly crimson, his face thinner, gaunter, as though the voice had already begun hollowing him out. Rage surged inside him, rage at the signal, at the cycle, at himself for being too weak to fight it. In a burst of desperation, he seized a heavy piece of broken metal from the floor and raised it high above his head. If he destroyed the lantern, maybe, just maybe, he could end it. Shards of glass scattered across the floor as he brought it down once, twice, 3 times. The lantern flickered violently, the room plunging into near darkness. The hum faltered, stuttering like a broken machine. For the first time, Henry thought he might have won. But then the clock struck 12. The sound was deafening, not a chime but a detonation that ripped through his mind. The lantern flared brighter than ever before, a blood-red sun flooding every corner of the room. Henry dropped the metal and fell to his knees, clutching his throat as his body convulsed. The words came, not as whispers, not as thoughts, but as a torrent bursting from within. His voice rose, steady and strong, as though it had always belonged to someone else. He spoke names. He spoke stories. He spoke secrets that he should never have known. His voice rolled out into the night, carried across the airwaves, reaching every diner, every lonely apartment, every sleepless soul hunched beside a radio in the dark. The listeners leaned closer, their faces slack with rapture, drinking in every word. Across America, radios crackled to life, even ones turned off, their dials glowing red. The broadcast spread like a sickness, unstoppable, undeniable. And at the heart of it all was Henry's voice. Inside the lantern room, Henry's body trembled, his eyes glowing brighter with every word. He could feel himself slipping, his memories peeling away like wallpaper. His childhood, his parents, the night he first tuned into the broadcast, all of it faded into static. He tried to cling to something, anything, but the signal was merciless. It took and took and took until only the voice remained. By the time the clock's final chime faded, Henry was gone. In his place sat the new host, slumped in the chair where the last had died. His eyes burned with that same feverish light, his lips curled into a hollow smile. The lantern pulsed in perfect rhythm with his breath. And across the airwaves, a new voice welcomed the listeners. Good evening, insomniacs. This is your midnight broadcast. I know you've been waiting. The cycle had begun again. The broadcast stretched on into the night, Henry's voice weaving stories that chilled the air and filled every silent room. He spoke with a calmness that betrayed the chaos inside him, his words flowing as though written long before he had ever drawn breath. Yet beneath that calm was something darker, something stitched into the very fabric of the sentences, an unholy rhythm that made listeners' hearts skip, a cadence that pulled them closer and closer until they could not pull away. Across small towns and cities, in truck stops and high-rise apartments, people sat frozen, their radios glowing faintly red. Some whispered along with the broadcast as if hypnotized. Others cried without knowing why. A few tried to turn the knobs, to silence the signal, but no matter how hard they twisted, the voice only grew louder. It wasn't just in the machines anymore. It was in the walls. The wiring. The silence itself. In one diner on the edge of Route 66, a waitress dropped a pot of coffee as the voice called her name. She hadn't given her name to anyone in weeks, yet the radio spoke it as though Henry had been standing behind her the whole time. In a third-floor apartment in Chicago, a man sat bolt upright in bed as Henry described his recurring nightmares in exact, word-for-word detail. And on a freight truck barreling down a lonely interstate, a driver gripped the wheel in horror as Henry told him the precise moment his brakes would fail. Listeners tried calling the station, but every number rang busy. Some even drove through the night, desperate to find the source, but the maps betrayed them. Highways curved where they shouldn't. Bridges led to nowhere. Every road folded back on itself, dragging the seekers into endless loops until they gave up or vanished altogether. The lighthouse did not want to be found, not by those who weren't chosen. Back in the lantern room, Henry sat slouched in the chair, his hands limp on the armrests. His eyes were dull yet glowing, his body present but no longer his own. The signal used him like a puppet, his mouth moving without pause, his voice flowing steady and smooth. But somewhere deep within, beneath layers of static and shadow, a fragment of Henry still screamed. He banged against the walls of his own mind, begging for release, but no one could hear him, not even himself. The old host's body, still crumpled at Henry's feet, had begun to dissolve into dust. The signal left nothing behind, not flesh, not memory, not identity. Only the voice remained, immortal and unchanging, carried on the airwaves long after the human vessel was gone. Henry understood then, with a clarity sharper than any blade, there had never been one host. There had been countless, each consumed in turn, their identities devoured until only the broadcast endured. And so, the show continued. "Good evening, insomniacs," Henry's voice purred, the words smoother now, more assured, as if centuries of practice guided his tongue. "Tonight, we'll talk about secrets, the kind you've never told a soul, the kind you've buried deep enough to make you believe they're gone. But I know them. I know you. And I promise, you'll stay with me until the end." The hum beneath his words grew stronger, threading into the listeners' minds, knitting them tighter into the signal. Across the nation, people leaned closer to their radios, wide-eyed and trembling, desperate to know what would come next. For many, the outside world no longer mattered. Their jobs, their families, their lives, all paled beside the midnight voice that seemed to know them better than they knew themselves. The signal had found its next generation of faithful. And Henry, whether he wanted it or not, had become their prophet. The broadcast had seeped into every corner of America. Radios, televisions, even phone lines carried the voice now. At first, it was only static, a faint hum like a storm rolling in from a great distance. But then, inevitably, the words followed, the low, measured cadence of Henry's voice spilling into homes, into cars, into the fragile silence of bedrooms. Families sat up in the middle of the night, unable to recall what had awakened them, until they realized the voice was already there, murmuring from devices they hadn't turned on. In the quiet of a hospital ward, patients who had lain unconscious for weeks stirred, their lips moving in unison with the broadcast. In an old church, the choir froze mid-hymn as every speaker, microphone, and amplifier inside erupted with Henry's sermon. Truckers swore they could hear him over the roar of the highway, his voice vibrating inside their skulls even with the radio unplugged. The air itself carried the signal now. There was no off switch. Henry sat hunched in the lighthouse, the journal splayed open on the desk beside him, its pages filled with entries that were no longer written in the keeper's shaky 1800s hand, but in his own. His name appeared in the margins. His thoughts bled across the paper. The journal no longer recorded the past. It was writing him. Every word he spoke into the microphone materialized in ink before him, sealing itself into history as though it had always been there. He wanted to scream, to rip the pages out, to set fire to the whole cursed book. But the instant the thought crossed his mind, the pen at the desk twitched and scrawled a new line across the page. He thinks of rebellion, but the voice reminds him, there is no leaving. There is only the broadcast. Henry froze, bile rising in his throat. The journal knew his thoughts before he could act on them. Worse, it anticipated them, guiding him down paths he hadn't chosen. For a brief, flickering second, he wondered if there had ever been a choice at all. And then came the revelation. As he gazed into the flickering lantern light of the tower, he saw shadows begin to stretch across the walls. They weren't his own, nor were they the old keepers. They were hosts. Dozens of them, their faces blurred and hollow, their mouths wide and whispering in unison. Some wore clothes from the Civil War era, others from the Great Depression, others from only decades ago. They lined the room, shoulder to shoulder, a congregation of the forgotten. Each had once been a vessel, consumed and discarded. Henry realized with horror that the broadcast was not a program, not a show, not even a voice. It was a hunger. A parasite that latched onto lonely minds, feeding on their fears and secrets, using hosts like batteries until nothing remained but ash. The lighthouse hadn't been built to save sailors, it had been built as a beacon for the thing inside it. A permanent altar for a signal that wanted not to guide ships, but to lure souls. And now, Henry was part of it. The whispers of the shadows pressed closer, seeping into his ears, his skin, his very bones. Read, they hissed. Speak. Continue. They're listening. He glanced at the journal again. The next entry was already written, waiting for him to say the words aloud. Good evening, insomniacs. Tonight's broadcast is our last. Tomorrow, you'll all join me. Henry's hand shook as he reached for the microphone, fighting against the invisible pull that guided his movements. His throat burned with the effort to resist. But outside the lighthouse, across the world, countless listeners sat frozen in the glow of their radios, their wide, glassy eyes waiting. They were his congregation now. They demanded his voice. The static rose. The lantern flickered. The journal bled more words across the page. Henry leaned into the mic. His lips parted. The shadows smiled. And the world held its breath. The silence before the final words was unbearable. Henry hovered over the microphone, his breath trembling, his body heavy as though the air itself had thickened around him. The journal's ink still bled across the pages, sentences forming faster than his eyes could follow, each line demanding to be spoken. His heart pounded like a drum inside a coffin, and for one fleeting instant, he believed he could resist. If he kept his lips closed, if he refused to speak, maybe the broadcast would falter. Maybe the world would remain intact. But outside, the signal had already seeped too deeply. Across the country, millions sat transfixed, eyes glazed, ears straining for the next syllable. Their collective silence pressed against Henry's skull like a tidal wave. The listeners weren't waiting out of curiosity anymore, they were tethered to him, bound like marionettes to invisible strings. He felt their hunger as if it were his own, an aching, gnawing emptiness that could only be filled by his voice. The shadows of the old hosts crowded closer, their hollow mouths stretched wide, whispering in 1,000 overlapping tones. Say it, say it, say it, their words buzzed like a swarm of flies, crawling beneath his skin, filling his veins. Henry tried to cover his ears, but their voices were inside him now. He could feel their fingers tugging on his throat, urging the words upward. His resistance was nothing more than a game to them, a child holding a door shut against a hurricane. And then, with a trembling exhale, he broke. Good evening, insomniacs, he whispered, his voice barely audible at first, then rising, smooth and steady as the static swallowed the room. Tonight's broadcast is our last. Tomorrow, you'll all join me. The lantern blazed white-hot, filling the chamber with a blinding glow. The shadows convulsed, their whispers crescendoing into screams of triumph. The journal's pages flipped wildly as if caught in a storm, the ink etching furiously, rewriting history faster than Henry could comprehend. For an instant, he saw the words, "The signal is not bound to this room. It is bound to the host. And now the host is bound to all." And then the world began to unravel. In living rooms, in cars, in motel rooms off forgotten highways, listeners' bodies jerked violently as the broadcast pierced deeper than sound. Some clawed at their ears until blood ran down their necks. Others collapsed, eyes rolling back, their mouths moving in time with Henry's voice. Streetlights flickered in unison, televisions sputtered static, and even the wind outside shifted, carrying the cadence of the broadcast like a chant. Henry felt it too. His body wasn't his anymore. His veins pulsed with electricity, his heart sinking with the rhythm of the static. He could see through walls, through wires, through signals bouncing off satellites in the stratosphere. The lighthouse was no longer a building, it was a seed, and he was the root spreading outward, threading through every frequency, every channel, every sliver of silence left in the world. He screamed, but the scream came out smooth, velvet, composed, "You are mine now. All of you. And together, we will never sleep again." In that moment, Henry realized the final truth: the broadcast had never needed him, or the lighthouse, or the journal. It needed only a voice. A vessel to carry it. And once it had enough listeners, enough minds tethered to its current, it would no longer need radios at all. It would speak through humanity itself. The lantern shattered. The journal burst into flame. The shadows collapsed into a single, yawning maw of darkness that swallowed Henry whole. And across America, millions of lips moved in perfect unison, whispering the words that would never end. Good evening, insomniacs.